Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1, The Man in the Fog. The town of Coldhollow was a quiet place, unremarkable by most standards, but cozy and quaint to its inhabitants. It sat tucked between wooded hills and lazy rivers, its streets winding through decades-old houses and cobblestone alleys. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a map, nor the kind that people visited. That suited the residents just fine. Life was simple here, predictable even. Then the fog came. It began on an unseasonably warm autumn evening, rolling down from the hills in thick gray tendrils. It moved with purpose, unlike the gentle mists that sometimes kissed the streets in the early morning hours. No, this fog wasn't a visitor, it was an intruder. It clung to houses, swallowing their shapes, smothering streetlights, and silencing the world as it crept through Coldhollow. The air was damp and heavy, the quiet unnerving. Just a natural phenomenon, people said. It happens sometimes in the fall, they reassured one another. Those reassurances never settled well with Stephen Cooper. Stephen was just another face in the small town, a man in his mid-30s who kept mostly to himself. He worked at a hardware store on the edge of town, lived alone in a small, tidy bungalow, and had no family left to call. He liked it that way. His life was his own, simple and solitary, much like Coldhollow itself. That evening, Stephen lingered a little later at work. He spent the final hours of his shift organizing shelves and sweeping sawdust off the floors. The radio hummed quietly in the background, a crackling rendition of old blues songs filling the otherwise empty space. When Stephen finally glanced up at the clock, 9:12 p.m., he frowned. "Damn!" he muttered to himself, tossing his broom back into the corner. The walk home would take him 20 minutes on a clear night. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, locking up behind him. As the door clicked shut, he paused, taking in the world around him. Fog was already there, waiting. It hugged the parking lot in thick, murky waves. The streetlights were dim halos swallowed by gray, barely illuminating patches of the road. The silence hit Stephen like a wall. No crickets, no wind, no hum of far-off cars. Just nothing. Stephen exhaled sharply, puffing his cheeks as he forced a smile. "It's just fog," he told himself. "Nothing unusual." He shoved his hands in his coat pockets and started down the sidewalk, his shoes tapping rhythmically against the pavement. The first few minutes were uneventful. Cold but uneventful. The fog hung low around Stephen's ankles, like ghostly hands reaching out of the earth. He kept his eyes forward, counting his steps to pass the time. At step 312, the feeling started. It was faint at first, a small itch at the back of his neck, a feeling like someone's gaze was on him. Stephen slowed his pace and glanced over his shoulder. Nothing, just the fog, endless and gray. He laughed at himself, shaking his head. Stop being ridiculous. Still, he couldn't shake it. The feeling grew stronger with every step. As he crossed the empty intersection on Hill Street, he heard it. Footsteps. They were quiet but deliberate, matching his own. Stephen froze mid-step, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned around fully this time, scanning the murky void behind him. "Hello?" His voice sounded small, swallowed by the thick air. No answer. The fog stretched on forever, the road disappearing after just a few feet. Stephen rubbed his hands together, his breath visible in the cold. He turned back around and quickened his pace. Tap, tap, the footsteps followed. Stephen's pulse quickened, and he stopped again. Next time he heard the steps, they were closer. Tap, tap. "Who's there?" Stephen called, his voice sharper now. His eyes darted to the shadows behind him, but he saw nothing. Panic scratched at the edges of his mind. The feeling of being watched had turned into something worse, something heavy. The air felt thicker, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed into his skin, as if something unseen surrounded him. His brisk pace turned into a jog. Tap, 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 the footsteps followed. "Jesus," Stephen muttered, breaking into a run. The world around him disappeared. There were no houses, no lights, no streets, just fog, endless, suffocating fog. His breath came fast now, fogging up the space in front of him. He ran faster. Then the footsteps stopped. Stephen's legs slowed, his chest heaving. He turned to look back, bending slightly to catch his breath. There was nothing behind him. The silence pressed down harder, so thick it felt alive. He wasn't alone. In the gray nothingness ahead of him, a shape emerged. At first, it was nothing but a silhouette, blurry and undefined, like a smudge in reality itself. But as it came closer, the details sharpened. It was a man, at least it looked like one. The figure was tall and thin, unnaturally so. Its limbs were elongated, the arms hanging low by its sides. But it wasn't the body that froze Stephen where he stood. It was the face, or rather the absence of one. The man's head was smooth and featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just skin, stretched and pale, as though someone had erased the details with a cruel hand. Stephen wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. The figure raised one hand. Long, spindly fingers curled slightly as they reached towards Stephen. It was a beckoning gesture, slow and deliberate. "Run," his mind screamed, and his body obeyed. He spun around and bolted, sprinting back the way he came. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. The houses and streets he knew so well had disappeared, swallowed whole by the fog. It didn't matter, Stephen ran anyway. But when he risked a glance over his shoulder, the man was still there. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. The figure walked with slow, measured steps, as though it knew something Stephen didn't, that no matter how far he ran, he would never escape. The fog grew heavier. The streetlights dimmed further. Stephen's foot caught on something, a crack maybe, and he stumbled, landing hard on the pavement. Pain shot up his palms where they scraped the ground, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. When he looked up, the figure stood in front of him. It was closer now, only a few feet away. The hand was still outstretched, those long fingers waiting. The faceless head tilted ever so slightly, as though curious. "No," Stephen whispered, backing away. "Stay away from me." The man didn't move, but the weight of his presence pressed harder against Stephen's mind. The fog seemed to pulse, vibrating softly with something unseen. Stephen clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. And then everything stopped. The silence returned, as suffocating as ever. Stephen opened his eyes. The figure was gone. The fog was thinner now, the streetlights starting to regain their shape in the distance. Stephen let out a shaky laugh, his relief overwhelming. He stood up slowly, wincing as he brushed dirt from his hands. He turned toward the dim glow of his house, only a few blocks away now. But as he took his first step forward, he heard them. Tap, tap. The footsteps were louder this time. Closer, deliberate. Stephen didn't have time to scream before the fog swallowed him whole. The next morning, Coldhollow woke to find the streets clear. The sky was pale blue, the sun burning through the last wisps of mist. The town returned to its peaceful rhythms, the events of the night before forgotten by most. Except for one thing. Near the corner of Hill Street, a pair of shoes sat neatly by the curb. They belonged to Stephen Cooper, but of Stephen himself there was no sign. Over the years, Coldhollow came to know the fog well. It returned each fall, silent and slow, sweeping through the town like a thief in the night. People learned to stay indoors when the gray rolled in. They locked their doors, closed their windows, and whispered stories to one another. Stories about the man in the fog. Some say they've seen him. standing still in the mist, his faceless head turned toward them. Others swear they've heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, always following. And every now and then, when the fog creeps in just right, someone disappears. But the shoes always remain. Story 2, Whispers from the Closet. The wind howled outside the Wilsons' modest suburban home, rattling the windows and whistling through cracks. Ella's father promised he'd fix someday. 6-year-old Ella sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the closet on the far side of the room. Her nightlight painted soft yellow glows on the walls, but no light ever seemed to reach the closet. Its door, slightly ajar, sat like a mouth half open, waiting. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Flopsy, tighter. "Mommy!" she called, her voice thin and trembling. Her mother, Emily, appeared in the doorway moments later, hair frazzled and face soft with exhaustion. "Ella, what is it this time?" "They're talking again," Ella whispered, pointing to the closet. Emily sighed, stepping into the room. She sat on the edge of Ella's bed and brushed a lock of hair from her daughter's face. "Who's talking, sweetheart?" "The voices. In the closet," Ella said matter-of-factly. "They whisper to me when it gets dark." Emily smiled faintly, though her gaze flickered toward the closet for just a moment Ella caught. "It's probably just the wind. This old house makes funny sounds, remember?" "It's not the wind," Ella insisted. "They know my name. They say, 'Ella, come play with us.'" Emily forced another smile. "You've been having a lot of nightmares lately. I think maybe you need a break from those spooky shows Daddy lets you watch. Ella opened her mouth to protest, but Emily kissed her forehead and pulled the covers up around her shoulders. "Get some sleep, love. Tomorrow's a new day." As her mother left, switching off the light, Ella stared at the closet again. It was darker now, an inky void in the corner of the room. She swore the whispers were there, just below hearing, soft like wind rustling dry leaves. The next morning, as Ella sat at the breakfast table pushing cereal around her bowl, she told her father about the whispers. "Closet, huh?" her father David asked between sips of coffee. "I used to think my closet was haunted when I was a kid, too. Turns out it was just my brother playing pranks on me." "But Daddy, it's not like that," Ella said, her voice small. "They're real." David leaned down and tapped her nose playfully. "I'll tell you what, Squirt. Tonight, we'll check it out together. We'll show those ghosts who's boss, all right?" Ella managed a small smile. "Okay, Daddy." But as the day went on, that uneasy feeling never quite left. Even in the sunlight pouring through her window, the closet door seemed to loom, a dark mouth biding its time, retreated to the living room. That night, after Emily had kissed Ella goodnight and retreated to the living room, David stuck to his word. He entered Ella's room, flashlight in hand, a playful smirk on his face. "All right, little ghost hunter," David said. "Let's show those closet monsters there's nothing to be scared of." Ella sat up in bed, clutching Mr. Flopsy. She watched as her father crossed the room, each step sending a shiver up her spine. The closet door stood slightly ajar, as always. It wasn't open enough to see inside, just enough to feel like it might be looking back. "Here we go," David said, pulling the door wide with a dramatic swing. The closet was small, no different from any other. Rows of little dresses and coats hung from a bar, and shelves lined the walls, holding boxes of toys, old shoes, and winter blankets. "See?" David said, turning to his daughter with a grin. "Just clothes and toys, no monsters." But as he moved to shut the door, David paused. The room had gone colder, hadn't it? A sudden prickle ran across the back of his neck. Slowly he turned his head back toward the closet. At first he thought he imagined it. The sound, so faint it could have been nothing at all. Whispers. David frowned and leaned closer. The whispers were real. Voices soft and playful like children, giggling, murmuring, just beyond understanding. "Ella, come play with us," a voice hissed, clear as a bell. David's blood ran cold. He stumbled back a step, staring into the dark recesses of the closet. What the... Then it happened. From the blackness, a small hand shot out, pale and thin, latching onto David's wrist. David yelled, jerking back violently. The hand was ice cold, its grip unreasonably strong for something so small. He yanked himself free, stumbling into Ella's bed and knocking the nightlight to the floor. The room fell into darkness, but not before David slammed the closet door shut, his chest heaving. Ella screamed, burying herself under the covers. Emily burst into the room seconds later, flipping the light switch. "What happened?" she demanded, staring at David, who stood against the wall, pale and trembling. David didn't answer. He stared at the closet door, his wrist red with marks where the hand had gripped him. Next day, David didn't go to work. Instead, he nailed the closet door shut. Emily protested at first, calling it overkill, but David wouldn't hear it. "There's something wrong with that closet," he told her, hammering in the last nail. His voice was low, almost desperate. "We're not taking any chances." Ella watched from the hallway, clutching Mr. Flopsy. She never said a word. That night, as the family sat around the dinner table, no one mentioned the closet. They ate in silence, the clink of silverware on plates the only sound. When Emily finally spoke, it was about the weather. "Storm's coming in tonight," she said, glancing out the window at the dark clouds gathering. "Hope it doesn't knock the power out again." David nodded absent-mindedly, but his gaze flickered toward the ceiling, toward Ella's room. That night, the whispers returned. Ella lay awake, listening. The closet was boarded shut, but that hadn't stopped them. They were louder now, more insistent. She could hear them through the wood, voices overlapping, giggling, pleading. "Ella, come play with us." Tap, tap, her heart raced. The sound was faint but unmistakable, tapping, like fingernails against wood, coming from inside the closet. Ella squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking onto her pillow. "Go away," she whispered. "Leave me alone." The voices only giggled. "Ella, don't leave us here." The tapping grew louder, faster, tap, 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 tap. She screamed. David and Emily burst into the room moments later to find Ella sobbing, pointing at the closet. "They're in there!" she cried. "They won't stop." David's face was pale, his jaw tight. He put his hands on Ella's shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're here. It's just the wind." Story 3, the tape that plays itself. Ryan Sanders had always been drawn to the old and the forgotten. He wasn't much of a social person. Rather, he preferred the quiet company of his thoughts and the stillness of vintage objects. VHS tapes, in particular, fascinated him. The crackling sound of a tape being ejected, the subtle hum of an old VHS player, it all had a charm, a nostalgia that modern technology couldn't replicate. He would spend hours scouring flea markets and thrift stores, digging through boxes of discarded tapes, hoping to uncover something unique, something that told a story. It was during one of these routine treasure hunts that Ryan discovered something unusual. It wasn't in the typical aisle filled with old action films, romantic comedies, or forgotten sitcoms. No, this one was hidden away, almost as if it didn't belong. It was tucked beneath a pile of dusty cassettes in the farthest corner of a thrift shop. The tape was plain, nothing special about it. A small handwritten note on the label read, "Don't watch." Ryan's curiosity, always the dominant force in his life, flared up immediately. The warning was too intriguing to ignore. After all, what harm could one old tape do? He made the purchase without a second thought, eager to see what lay inside. He didn't think much of the peculiar note. After all, it was probably just an overzealous label from a past owner who didn't want anyone to watch their old memories. But there was something about it, something about the way the words were written. The careful, deliberate scrawl seemed to pulse with an odd sense of urgency. Once home, Ryan set up his old VHS player, the one he had inherited from his father years ago. The tape slid into place with an old, satisfying click, the whir of the machine filling the silence of the room. He sat down on the couch, excitement bubbling inside him. As he pressed play, first the screen was black, completely black, as though the TV wasn't even on. Ryan frowned, fiddling with the remote. He adjusted the brightness and contrast, checked the connections, but nothing changed. He was about to give up and eject the tape when a faint flicker appeared on the screen. Static, at first a strange, pulsing static that hummed with a low, menacing vibration. Then a voice, soft, barely audible, yet somehow distinct. Ryan. It was his name, his own name, spoken softly, almost lovingly, but with a distortion, a wrongness to it. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Who could be calling his name? It wasn't his voice. He would have recognized his own voice. But there it was again. He stood up, unease creeping down his spine. He glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing just behind him. But there was no one. No one at all. His eyes returned to the screen. A figure emerged from the static. First, it was just a shadowy blur, a vague shape, but then slowly it became clearer. A man standing in the center of his living room. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with short, dark hair. He was wearing a simple faded t-shirt, jeans, and Ryan's clothes. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His gaze flicked from the screen to the room around him, his heart racing. The man on the screen was standing in the exact same spot where Ryan had been just moments ago, right in the middle of the living room, and he was wearing Ryan's clothes. Ryan stumbled backward, almost tripping over the coffee table. His mind raced as he spun around, his eyes scanning the room. The living room was empty. There was no one behind him, no stranger lurking in the shadows. The only sound was the faint buzz of the TV and the distorted voice that now echoed in his ears. Ryan. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as the figure on the screen took a step forward. Ryan's stomach twisted. The man on the screen, his doppelganger, was moving, walking, as if he were right there in the room with him. The voice came again, now sounding almost frantic. "I'm here, Ryan. I'm right here." Ryan's eyes widened in horror as the man on the screen stepped closer to the camera. He was now standing just behind the couch, only inches away from the screen, his face warped with a twisted smile that sent chills down Ryan's spine. "No," Ryan whispered to himself. "This isn't real." He quickly reached for the remote, his fingers trembling as he pressed the eject button. The tape clicked, and Ryan ripped it from the player. But as he did, the TV flickered. The screen came back to life. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The man was still there. Only now, he was right in front of the camera. Right up against the screen, his face only inches away, his eyes wide and unblinking. The smile had vanished, replaced with an empty, hollow stare. The voice came again, but this time it was quieter, a whisper. "I'm here, Ryan. I'm always here." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was imagining this, if his mind was playing tricks on him. He grabbed the remote once more, furiously pressing the power button, but the TV wouldn't turn off. The picture remained, flickering, the man's face still hovering close to the screen. Ryan's legs gave way, and he sank to the floor, his mind racing, his thoughts scrambled. How could this be? What was happening? His eyes locked on the screen, unable to look away, as if some unseen force were holding him captive. His breathing grew shallow, rapid, as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The man on the screen didn't move. He just stared, the hollow, lifeless stare of someone who had no soul, no life, no purpose. Ryan wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, anything. but his voice caught in his throat. He was paralyzed by fear, his body locked in place as the man's eyes bore into his soul. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching across the walls as the static buzzed louder. The voice came again, low and almost loving. "Ryan, I'm here." And then suddenly the sound stopped. Silence. A thick, oppressive silence filled the room. Ryan didn't dare move. His eyes were still fixed on the screen, his body rigid with fear. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. No noise, no movement, just the image of the man's lifeless stare. And then a knock. Ryan's head snapped toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know if it was real, if it was part of the madness his mind was spiraling into. But there was a knock at the door, a knock that seemed far too real. Ryan staggered to his feet, his mind in a daze. He stepped toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. Ryan opened the door. It was his voice, but not quite. The voice that called to him from beyond the door was distorted, just like the voice on the tape. It was a voice that sounded like his own, yet there was something wrong about it. Something twisted, something hollow. He hesitated, fear freezing him in place. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet felt heavy, as if they were anchored to the floor by some unseen force. The knock came again, this time more insistent, more frantic. "Ryan, please, open the door." Ryan's heart raced as the room seemed to close in around him. He knew he couldn't open that door. He couldn't let whatever was on the other side in. But as the seconds stretched into eternity, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was calling to him was already inside. Days passed before the police found him. Ryan was never seen again. The TV was still on when they arrived, the screen flickering and buzzing with static. On the screen, a video played of Ryan sitting motionless, staring back at the camera with empty, hollow eyes. The police searched the house, the rooms, the closets, the attic, but Ryan was nowhere to be found. Only the TV remained, its faint hum filling the silence of the empty house, and the tape that never stopped playing. Story 4. The Reflection in the Water. Chris Bennett had always enjoyed the solitude of nature. He was the kind of person who found peace in the quiet of the forest, in the rustle of the leaves, and in the stillness of the mountains. He didn't mind hiking alone. In fact, he preferred it. It was during one of his solo trips, on a warm summer afternoon, that he discovered the hidden pond. He had wandered far off the beaten trail, following a faint animal track and the distant calls of birds overhead. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking. Time seemed irrelevant when surrounded by such beauty. But as the air grew cooler, he stumbled upon something unexpected. A small, secluded pond lay nestled in a hollow, its waters eerily still. The surface was so calm that it mirrored everything above and around it perfectly, as though the water itself was a perfect reflection of the world above. Chris took a moment to admire the scene. The pond was surrounded by tall trees whose branches stretched toward the sky, their reflections as clear as the real thing. A few small rocks lined the edge, and he could see the occasional ripple caused by a gentle breeze brushing the surface. It was serene, like something out of a dream. The pond seemed to draw him in. He took a few steps closer, intrigued by how untouched and tranquil it appeared. With a quiet sigh, Chris leaned over the water's edge, gazing at his reflection. He ran a hand through his hair, making sure his rugged appearance, sweaty and disheveled from the hike, was in place. But as he looked into the water, something strange caught his eye. At first, it was subtle. The reflection of his face seemed slightly off, like the way a painting might distort reality. He furrowed his brow. Not sure why he felt a sense of unease. The reflection smiled at him, a crooked smile that was just a little too wide, the corners of his mouth stretching too far. He blinked and shook his head. Maybe he was just tired. As he tilted his head slightly to the left, so did his reflection, but it didn't match his movement. The reflected image stayed perfectly still, the smile still stretched too wide, and the eyes darker. The pupils were dilated, like holes in the face, sucking in the light around them. They glowed with an unnatural blackness, an emptiness that sent a shiver crawling up Chris's spine. He quickly straightened up, pulling back from the water as his pulse quickened. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "It's just your imagination," he muttered aloud, trying to reason with himself. But as he glanced back at the pond, his reflection didn't seem to be his own anymore. The figure in the water moved its mouth, but no sound reached his ears. That's when it happened. Reflection's grin widened even further. The smile stretched unnaturally across its face, the corners of the mouth splitting to an impossible degree. The eyes, those empty, dark eyes, seemed to widen in glee as the reflection began to change. A sense of dread filled Chris's chest as the image in the water began to take on a life of its own. Without warning, the reflection's mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed white and wet in the murky water. The thing in the pond, the reflection, suddenly lunged forward with a speed Chris couldn't comprehend. A hand, no, a claw, shot out of the water. Its fingers were long, with skin stretched too tightly, like the fingers of a corpse that had been submerged for years. The fingers wrapped around Chris's neck with terrifying force, cold and slick like ice. Chris screamed in shock and terror, feeling the grip tighten, his windpipe being crushed under the pressure, stumbled backward, kicking his legs and trying to wrench himself free. But the hand held him firmly, pulling him closer to the water's edge. He could feel the coldness of the water as it lapped against his boots, and he knew if he was pulled in, he would be gone, dragged under the surface into the depths of whatever dark, unearthly thing waited below. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought, grabbing at the clawed fingers with all his strength. He pried them away with desperate energy, his nails scraping against the slimy surface of the hand. Every part of him screamed to escape, to survive, to get away from whatever was trying to drag him into the pond. Just as his vision began to blur and his breath became shallow, the hand abruptly released him. Chris collapsed backward, gasping for air, his body trembling in sheer panic. The water around him seemed to settle, as though nothing had happened. The hand that had nearly killed him was gone. The pond was still again, too still. There were no ripples, no signs of movement. It was as if nothing had ever occurred. He looked down at his soaked clothes and ragged breath, trying to gather his bearings. His heart raced in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, feeling his body shake with the aftershocks of what had just transpired. His fingers gripped the ground beneath him as he staggered away from the pond, his legs weak and unsteady. But as he turned to look one last time at the water, he froze. The reflection in the pond had returned. It wasn't just a mirror image anymore. It was something else entirely. The figure in the water was no longer his reflection. It was the creature, the thing with the black eyes, the jagged teeth, and the wide, hungry smile. And it was smiling directly at him. Chris's breath caught in his throat as the reflection raised a hand and waved at him, the motion slow and deliberate. It was his hand, his reflection, his image, but it wasn't him. The smile on the creature's face widened as it gave one final, slow wave before sinking into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. The pond was quiet again, too quiet. Chris didn't wait another second. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, to stumble away from the cursed water. The path back to the trail seemed longer than it had before, and every step felt heavier. The woods, once peaceful and tranquil, now felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were watching him. Every creak of the branches, every crackle of a twig beneath his feet, sent a jolt of panic through his system. By the time he made it back to his campsite, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, of being followed. At night, as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames to distract himself, Chris tried to push the terrifying memory of the pond from his mind. He convinced himself it had all been some strange hallucination, a product of exhaustion or stress. But when he returned to his tent and gazed into the small mirror he kept in his pack, the unease settled back into his bones. His reflection wasn't quite right. The smile was too wide, too perfect, and when he leaned closer, he saw that his eyes, his real eyes, looked hollow, dark, like they had no life in them. And then the reflection smiled at him. But it wasn't the real smile. It was the same jagged, sharp-toothed grin from the pond. It was the creature, the thing from the water, and it was grinning at him, right through the glass. His breath caught in his throat as the reflection in the mirror waved, slowly, mockingly, and then to Chris's horror, the reflection stepped through the glass. The mirror shattered with a sharp crack as the thing's hand reached out, pulling itself through the shards and into the room. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes, those empty black eyes, stared at him with hunger. Chris screamed, but it was too late. Story 5, The Christmas Visitor. It was the night before Christmas, and the small town of Hollow Creek was blanketed in snow. The streets were empty, and every house had its lights glowing warmly in the dark winter night. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that filled the lungs with each breath, yet everyone inside their homes was cozy, surrounded by the warmth of holiday decorations and the scent of pine and cinnamon. For the Winters family, it was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. This year, after many months of hardship, they had finally managed to get together in their old farmhouse. Claire, the mother, had worked tirelessly to prepare the house, stringing up wreaths, baking cookies, and wrapping presents. Her husband, Mark, was in the living room, putting together a toy train set for their son, Jake. Even their daughter, Lily, who had just turned 13, was excited for the Christmas morning to come. It was a rare moment of peace for the family, and Claire felt a sense of relief settle over her as she gazed out the window, watching the snow fall gently to the ground. The world outside was perfect, serene even, but that peace was shattered by a loud knock at the door. Claire glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight, an odd time for visitors, especially on Christmas Eve. She frowned, wondering who it could be. Mark had already gone to bed, and their kids were fast asleep upstairs. She hesitated for a moment, the silence stretching between her and the door, before she made her way down the hall. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Who on earth?" Claire muttered to herself, her nerves fraying. She opened the door cautiously, her hand gripping the knob. Standing on the doorstep was a tall man, dressed in an old-fashioned coat, ragged at the edges, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, dark hat. He wore a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, though his breath came out in visible puffs, as though he were cold despite the warmth of the night. The stranger didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at Claire with dark, empty eyes. "Can I help you?" Claire asked, her voice shaking slightly. The man's lips parted, but it wasn't a voice that answered. Instead, there was a low, guttural sound, a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "Let me in. I'm lost." Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to slam the door. Something was wrong with him. His presence felt unnatural, like the darkness of the night had clung to him. But she wasn't the type to turn someone away in the cold, especially on Christmas Eve. "Are you all right?" she asked, her heart pounding. "You should be inside where it's warm." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He took a step forward, and Claire recoiled instinctively. There was something in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. "Please," he whispered again. "I need to come in." Something inside Claire snapped. She reached for the door to close it, but before she could, the man's gloved hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with terrifying strength. His grip was like ice, sending a jolt of panic through her. "Don't." Before she could finish the sentence, a shadow flickered behind him. It was an odd, dark shape, like a large figure moving just beyond the porch light. It was hard to focus on, as if the shadow itself was somehow out of place. Claire's breath hitched. "Mark!" she called out, her voice rising in panic. The stranger's grip tightened on her wrist, pulling her toward him. His eyes grew darker, and his lips stretched into an eerie smile. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he whispered, his voice colder now. Claire tried to pull away, but his hand was like iron, his fingers digging into her skin. With a scream, she kicked at his shins, desperate to break free. The door flew open, slamming against the wall, and she stumbled backward into the cold night. Suddenly, the shadow behind the man moved again. It was taller now, its outline growing larger as it crossed the threshold of the door, stepping onto the porch. "Let go of her!" Mark's voice rang out from behind her. Mark charged toward the man, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away. But the man didn't budge. His eyes turned to Mark, and for a moment, Claire saw something dark and unnatural, flicker in the stranger's gaze. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up, howling through the trees. The man's lips parted again, and a sharp, inhuman hiss escaped his throat. The shadow behind him grew larger, and Claire felt a wave of terror wash over her as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a stranger. It was something else, something old and twisted, with dark intentions that stretched far beyond a simple holiday visit. The shadow moved closer, wrapping around the man. It was a large, twisted thing, like a mass of black, suffocating fog, swirling and shifting in unnatural ways. The air grew thick, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. "No!" Claire shouted, her voice cracking. "Mark, get back inside!" Mark, struggling against the man's grip, finally broke free and pulled Claire back, dragging her toward the door. But the man's laughter echoed through the night, low and guttural. "You cannot run from what's coming," the stranger hissed. "I've been waiting for this night for a long time." Claire's pulse raced as they slammed the door shut, sealing themselves inside the house. The shadows outside shifted violently, pressing against the windows as if trying to claw their way in. Mark locked the door, his face pale. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Claire could barely answer. Her breath was ragged, and her heart hammered in her chest. "We need to call the police," she said, shaking her head. That wasn't human. But as she turned toward the phone, she froze. Lily and Jake stood at the top of the stairs, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank. Jake's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Who was at the door?" Claire's heart sank. She turned toward the door, where the darkness still pressed against the windows. And then she heard it, the faintest knock just beyond the door. Knock, knock, knock. The man's voice came again, just a whisper on the wind, as if it was inside the house with them. "I've come for you. The night is mine." As the knock grew louder, the shadows around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. Claire knew, deep down, that whatever was outside wasn't going to leave. not until it had taken what it had come for. The air in the room turned cold, freezing them in place. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. It was only then that Claire understood the true horror of the night. The Christmas visitor wasn't just a stranger. It was a spirit, a harbinger of the long, dark winter, and it had come to claim its prize. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.